Hi guys, welcome back to Courage Dear Heart. This is Charli Wall with another episode of my brilliant podcast. And this week I was really lucky to have Jan and Chipman come along and speak to me and have a conversation for my podcast with me, and then come into my circle community to answer questions and get coached. Well, do the coaching for my circle ladies. The extraordinary thing about Jan and Chip is that, for those of you that don't know, I work as a 3 principles practitioner, amongst other things. And Jan and Chip are very well known and very well respected in the 3 principles community, and were trained by Syd Banks himself, who is the Scottish gardener that saw these principles of human nature. And back in 2018, I was extraordinarily anxious and thought I was broken, and had chronic symptoms of PTSD and huge physical symptoms of anxiety and PTSD. And I have a video of me being coached by Jan and Chip back in 2018. If you'd like access to this video of me being coached back before I'd really discovered anything about the principles, back when I really did think I was broken, please send me a message and I will send you a copy of that video of me being coached. It's a really important video as far as I'm concerned, because it can really show you what's possible when you come into this understanding or work with me on your anxiety or PTSD or habits of behavior or habits of thought, because you'll see very clearly the me then and the me now, and the huge difference between those two me's. But for now, I want to introduce you, if you haven't come across them before, to Jan and Chip. And they are just gorgeous humans. And I really hope that you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much. So this is Charli Wall. Welcome to Courage Dear Heart. And I'm really deeply honoured to be joined today by Jan and Chip Chipman. Welcome, guys.
Thanks.
you.
Thanks for having us. It's great.
Yes, you are so welcome. Thank you for being my guest, because you are people I hold in very high regard and high esteem, because for a lot of people that I work with, I share the video of me being coached by you back in 2018 when I was really struggling. But before I start, what I always ask my guests is, because my podcast is called Courage Dear Heart, I'd love to know what courage means for you. Either one of you.
Us. Oh, I thought we thought you meant your group.
No. I'm interviewing you for my podcast. The group will come in a bit later when the podcast is over.
Yeah. Well, courage is an interesting subject, because most of us think it takes courage to look at our faults and our insecurities and all the things that trouble us in this life. It takes courage to look at that. But actually, and maybe Jan can say more too, and as we go through this podcast, it actually takes more courage to look at what we have inside. It takes more courage to look at how beautiful we actually are on the inside. It's a strange thing that it takes more courage to look in that direction. Now, once we do, it doesn't take any courage at all. Right? And so when we first met Charli, that's what hit me is, as she said, she was really struggling, but what I saw in her was an enormous level of courage to be willing to listen beyond what she was struggling with, beyond what she thought was going on in her life, to something more powerful within. And she had a tremendous level of courage to do that. That's what I remember from our meeting and our working together. Yeah, so courage to me it's actually the courage to look to the silence. It's the courage to look to what we have inside.
And to me, when I think of courage, I think of being able to welcome the unknown and trust that you'll be okay, and that in some cases trust that it's worth that trust in the unknown to be there for others as well. So it could be courage for yourself to trust in the unknown and know that you'll be okay, or that you'll be able to help someone else. But ultimately, it's that you'll be okay in the unknown. That's the way I see it. So.
No, I really like that, because so many of my clients, and of course you will remember that I had no clue what the unknown was and was completely anxious and worried about coming over to Tenerife. And how would you, for anyone listening to the podcast or anyone who may be here, describe your kind of experience of being okay with the unknown?
Well, the unknown is not about something coming from the future. That's an interesting place to start, I think.
Yeah.
The unknown is actually the beauty that lies within. The unknown is that quiet space that we've not given ourselves for a long time. The unknown is that peaceful state that we don't give ourselves. And it's a strange thing. Again, like courage, it's a strange thing that we fear that unknown, that quiet, or it's foreign to us until we have the experience of sitting in that quiet, in that peaceful state, regardless of what we think our life circumstances are. Then once we're sitting there, of course, there's nothing to fear. So to me, the unknown, it's about the future in this sense. Okay, I said it wasn't about the future, it's about a state of mind, but we've always tried to control what we think is going to come in the future.
Mm.
And I'll just speak for myself, in spite of the fact that it did me no good, to try and control it. And yet when I started to experience a quiet mind once in a while and had that sense of I'll just see what comes, I'll just sit with it and see what comes, then literally more beautiful things came for the most part. But also when things came along, because life is a contact sport, that weren't so beautiful, that were difficult, I felt present and able to deal with it, and unafraid of it, in the sense that I knew that it would pass and there's much more beauty than the other. So you get to the place with understanding and having a quieter mind where the future becomes more beautiful for a couple of reasons. The main one is when you find that health within yourself, you show up differently in life. You experience it differently because you show up differently, and life treats you differently because you do show up differently, and different things happen, more positive things happen. And the things that are not so positive are more easily handled from that clarity and that understanding.
Mm. And so that is a really brilliant point, which I think many people struggle with, and many of my audience don't. They kind of listen to me, they wouldn't really know what the principles are. That piece that you just spoke to about, I guess, being, in a clearer space to be able to deal with what arises, as in, yes, life is a contact sport. And what that means is, for anyone who doesn't understand that, is that shit happens. We're not saying it doesn't, are we? In this, we're not saying you ride along on cloud 9 100% of the time. What would you say to someone who was sort of struggling to grasp that? Like, what do you mean it can be clearer?
Well, it's interesting because I just had an insight this morning when I was thinking about one of our relatives that we always interact and we help each other out, and they were caught up in something, and I part of me was wanting to think about how to help them with that particular thing.
Mm.
And so I was it was in the back of my mind yesterday and today, and today I was making my breakfast, and it just hit me. I'm too preoccupied about helping someone else with something they're dealing with, all I have to do is just take care of myself, and I will know how to help them, or when to not, do too much. Try You find the balance of how much to help someone and how much to, be there without getting drawn into their details. And it hit me because I'm more help when I'm just taking care of myself. So that's how I'm really helping. Not carrying around the details of, well, how will I help them with that issue? And it was so beautiful because that's what always we heard originally from Syd, who was our mentor, was just take care of yourself and find your happiness, and then you'll automatically just function better in life, and you'll more help to the world in general. So it just kind of reminded me of that, and it stopped me in my tracks because I realized that my mind was getting busy with thoughts outside of myself, and I wasn't being present in the moment. So then I was
Mm.
making my finishing making my breakfast, and again I was starting to think about today, and because we've got some relatives that are on the island where we live, and that we're supposed to get together with them at some point. So in my head I'm starting to plan my day, and I looked at my bowl of porridge, and I think, just enjoy this moment, like, because so it's like always a constant learning of bringing myself back to the moment, because it's always kind of evading me, and then I remind myself. But it's a gift to know that I'm doing that, and that I
Yeah.
don't have to do that.
Yeah, it's like we all have conditioning, you know. We have all had experiences that influence how we engage with life, right? So
Mm.
I'll just speak about myself personally. Um, I grew up in a home with alcoholism and violence, and that's not to say that there weren't nice times too, but I just know that it was the hard times in my growing up. I was the oldest of 11 kids and had a whole thing in my mind about I should be able to protect my mother and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's no question in my mind that formed my personality as I became a young man. And looking back on it now, I can see so many ways it influenced how I interacted with the world. Like I a deep mistrust of authority, even when somebody was good to me from authority, like a teacher or a boss. I just had this really deep mistrust, and so that led to me having issues with school, issues with work, issues with friends. You know, it was my mindset interacting with the world instead of my true self interacting with the world, right? And so
Mm.
as we started to have insights and our minds got quieter, I started to notice and see places where my habits and my insecurities were actually hurting the present, right? Were actually hurting my present experience in this life. So I understand that, and I see that what happens to us to create those insecure and negative habits were real. Those things were real when they're happening. I experienced that, and it was terrible, right? But what I came to see later in life is that today, like in this moment, if I, just as an example, I don't anymore, but for the most part, let's say I'm experiencing that mistrust of authority or whatever. That's got nothing to do actually with what actually happened in the past. That has to do with carrying that thought and operating out of that thought. For me, that kind of still happens when I'm really tired or whatever. It still happens. So the
Mm-hmm.
clarity is the absence, learning to have a quieter mind, learning to trust that true self that's inside. So the clarity is actually the absence of all that thought, at least most of the time. And when you walk in that, then that's those moments when you see that what you think is happening maybe isn't happening, or that you can handle it differently. So I'll give you a specific example. I landed a job as an HR manager in a large corporation once, and I was really thrilled with it. And the guy that hired me took a risk because there were people who on paper were much more qualified than me, right? And so I went to work, and I'll just say the reason he hired me is we had an incredible conversation about thought and separate realities. and he was having a lot of problems with his employee base, right? And he wanted to do a better job. He wanted to connect with his employees. And in our conversation about separate realities, and he saw something. He saw how he could reconnect, right? So that's why he hired me. Anyway, so then I start the job, and there's so much to learn, right? And I get a little insecure about all the stuff I have to learn and things I have to do, and I start complaining to Jan at night that there's too much and all this kind of stuff, right? So as I get into that mindset, I'm at work one day, and this will show my age. It was when the first little screens on your phone came in that told you what extension was calling you, right?
On your landline, not
On your landline. There were no cell phones then. So I'm in my office and the phone rings. I look and it's my boss, and I immediately feel this insecurity, right? Like, oh, geez, what is wrong, one, right?
Mm.
So I pick up the phone. He says, "Could you come down and see me if you got a minute?" So I have to walk from one end of the building to the other through the engineering department and everything, and all the way I'm making up all kinds of meaning about what Ron wants. Did I do this wrong? Did I do that? Does he think I'm not, doing my job? And by the time I get there, I'm all like, So he has me in, and then he orders coffee. He asks somebody, his assistant, to bring us coffee. So now I think this is really serious. I'm really in big trouble, right? So I sit down, and he says to me, these are his exact words. He says, "Do you know what a smoking gun is?" I thought, "I don't know what you mean." And what he meant was I had made a promise that was out of my level of responsibility to grant with a group of people,
Mm.
In the moment I said, "Oh yeah, we could do that," right? Which meant it was going to create problems. It all got worked out. So as soon as he says that, now I'm like, oh. So he starts explaining to me how that should be handled. And I'm like full of fear, I'm full of insecurity, and then suddenly it just stopped. And I looked at him and I realized I had this tremendous guy mentoring me and helping me in an area that I knew nothing about, right? And I went from feeling this amazing insecurity to feeling gratitude for having such a boss and having him care enough to sit down with me and just very kindly and carefully help me understand the situation. So that's an example of me for a while living out of my conditioning, my belief system, my insecurity, and then the clarity coming back and seeing what was actually in front of me.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that example. I think that's just perfect. And I think hopefully the ladies who are listening here, when they listen again, will hear what you're saying. Jan, what was life like for you? Because Chip kind of mentioned a little bit about what life was like for him prior to coming across this and that sort of conditioning that he held. What was it like for you prior to meeting Syd?
I guess the main thing was that I would believe that my unhappiness was being caused by people and events, that I didn't have any control over it. And I was basically a happy person growing up, but as I got older and again, life happens, right? I got a kick out of when you said "shit happens" because I thought I couldn't picture
Sure.
I couldn't picture Syd saying "shit happens." Life is a contact sport.
Yeah, right.
So as I got older and I started experiencing life and being, so I would take things personally. I would, like when Chip was talking about being, thinking his boss was out to get him, that I would be the same, like insecure about if people were nice to me, it was fine, right? But if I came across somebody that was rude to me or I looked at them and they looked like they were stern and I didn't, before they even said anything, I would assume that they were going to either be look down on me or so that was, I basically had a lot of insecurities about what people thought of me and just again took it personally if somebody said something that I would take it, maybe they didn't mean it as something negative, but I would interpret it as negative.
Mm-hmm.
So like with family members or friends, And then, of course, in our marriage, I was dependent on Chip's happiness. So when he was talking about his early experiences in life were were upsetting for him, and when we first met, that wasn't coming out so much. He was more, we were just so, in the honeymoon feeling and in love and everything. But as time went on, and he started to slip into those memories and feelings about his upbringing, and he was more unhappy than when we first met. And so then I wouldn't feel comfortable just being happy myself while Chip was unhappy. So I was basically dependent on how Chip was being with life. And when
Mm.
I first heard something, what I heard was, if we could all see who we are inside and how beautiful we are inside, and that there's this whole other part of us that we don't know about, that's there to discover, that's absolutely perfect and beautiful. If we could all see that, we'd have all the happiness we could ever imagine. And in that moment, I heard something before my thoughts that I'd been accumulating over life, all my negative thoughts and my insecurities. Something slipped under the radar, and I really heard that, and I totally felt it and to be true. And that was 75, so that was like 47 years ago. And I still have some insecurities, but there was a switch in that moment that showed me I'd been basing my experience on events and people around me, and not realizing that life is being created from inside me, and that it's my life, and I can be as happy as I want. It's got nothing to do with anybody else. Like in that moment, I stopped blaming the world or Chip for any of my, and that was huge. That was huge. And I also, what I heard in the next few moments from that same person was, I didn't, they were talking wisdom, but what I saw was, it looks like the person who's talking right now has all the wisdom, but I saw the how false that was, because I knew in that moment that I'd always been attracted to wise words of people over my lifetime.
Mm.
And that, to me, the heart of it was, the wise people are always trying to say, no one can give you wisdom, or you have it all inside you already. And that came back to me in that moment, and I just felt it, like I really heard what the wise people were trying to tell us, is that wisdom is already in you. They're not giving it to you. And I remember actually thinking in my head, it looks like the wisdom's coming from the person who's talking, but it's already in me. It's really coming from me. How could it not be? And I realize I've had that wisdom my whole life, and I'll have it forever. And that's to me was security. That was my newfound discovery of security.
Mm. Yeah, and that is, I'd rather have faith in that than my intellect, which used to drive me quite nuts.
Mm. Mine still does sometimes.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. That's an important point that Jan just made, though. It's like, we've been around this for almost 50 years, right? And if you imagine that we don't have days when we can get into our thinking, then it's not right. It happens once in a while. The
Mm.
difference is this, is as you have those experiences that we're talking about, where clarity comes and your mind gets quiet, you begin to see that more and more that that's the true reality, and the other one is a made up reality from our heads, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so as time goes on, and like if I have a day when I'm tired and I get into my thinking and I feel a little bit of insecurity, I don't know how to express this in a way. I don't care. I just don't care.
Yeah.
Because your background understanding, so to speak, has grown to the point where you know what that is. Now you can't chase it away or say, I'm not going to feel that way, but that's okay. Because experience starts to show you that you will always return to that understanding state. And the fact is that even when you're down, you're still in that understanding state because you are understanding what it is. In my worst moments these days, I still know it's thought. I still know I'm just putting myself through something in the moment from some habit. And it's a strange thing to say that even when you're in it, you still feel whole. You know that it's going to pass. Right?
Yeah.
And just going back to the story that I shared about my boss, what was really interesting about that is how it set me up for my corporate career, because there were people who weren't fond of me being hired there and who didn't like me. There was like a guy who was my corporate boss who was the head of HR for this huge corporation. It was a Fortune 500 company. And he really disagreed with me being hired. He had somebody that he thought it should be. So I had it like an enemy from day one when I started there. But that experience I had with Ron set me up one step back, rather than being in it, just one step back. And so, not all the time, but most of the time as time went on, and I encountered that fella, and he was harsh and I'll just say it, kind of conniving, if you will. I didn't slip into insecurity. I didn't react to it for the most part. And that not reacting to it changed how he could see it wasn't getting him anything. And so slowly it fell away. And because I stayed within myself and just continued to enjoy my job in spite of this guy, we started to win awards and everything in the corporation for what we were doing. And then that just disappeared, right? So that one experience of seeing what was going on with my actual boss in the moment set me up to see life from that present non-defensive state. And it actually did change the way the world interacted with me,
That reminds me of the Second Chance, the second book. I think it's the second book where he's had that experience already, and then he goes back and describes how he saw his boss, through really compassionate eyes, and he wasn't insecure in that moment, and what he saw was a troubled man innocently paying attention to what he was going through. And I think that's the gift that it's freed me, as you can potentially remember and see, and the ladies here, I've shown them that so they can literally see how it's freed me. So just to sort of, as a closing, it's not long enough really, but as a closing hopeful statement to give the listeners who aren't able to be here, in the circle, but who may be struggling with anxiety or insecurity. I mean, would you say, just quickly, it's all insecurity? Yeah. So what would you say to someone who was struggling with anxiety, insecurity, or something where they didn't realize that's what it was? What would you say?
I'd say that we have an inner guide that shows us who we really are on the inside before the insecurity. And when that guide is speaking to us is when we're feeling a beautiful feeling. So I would say pay attention to the times when you're having a beautiful feeling and you just feel that peace. Sometimes it just happens to us. We may be walking down the road and all of a sudden we get distracted from our worried thoughts by a beautiful sunset or nature. Could be something beautiful happens, with your loved ones. Or so when you get that beautiful feeling, that's your clue that you're in touch with that true self. And if it takes sometimes slowing down your life so that you make sure you have time to have those beautiful feelings, and give yourself time to go for a walk or do something that you love that gives you a sense of peace. Because often we get so driven that we forget to nurture ourselves that way.
Yeah.
And you know, when Jan's talking about the feeling, there's something that Syd says that people quite often don't really understand. He says there's information in a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Go, well, how can there be information in a feeling? Right? Well, the information is when that beautiful feeling comes. That is your true self. That's who you really are. Like, it's a spiritual fact that everybody on this call, everybody everywhere, but everybody on this call, their true self has never been damaged, can never be damaged, will never be damaged. It's always there. It is who we really are, and it can never be damaged because it's not of this world, really. It's spiritual in nature, but it's there. And as we listen and we get quiet, the feeling, that beautiful feeling, is that true self coming to the surface. So when Jan and I first started listening, well, Jan did. I thought I was a bunch of hooey. I really, honestly, it's like so simple, like, give me a break, you know. But what happened was Jan changed, and I didn't like it at first, right? It put me off. Like, how can you be happy after all we've been through? This is ridiculous. It's a charade, you know. But what saved me in the end was that Jan's change was permanent, right? She had her ups and downs, but she was clearly living in a better place than me. So that finally brought curiosity in. And I share that because once that curiosity came, I started to listen to Syd's materials, to his recordings, and there weren't many around then. I heard him speak in person once or twice. And the strange thing was that our marriage changed, and I couldn't figure out what we did differently. Like, it wasn't like I went, I won't do this anymore, I won't do that, I won't say this. It just changed, and we were living in a much nicer place. And I still didn't understand what happened, right? And then one day I had listened to Syd, and I had got that, just a little taste of that feeling. And one day I was sitting on the couch, and Jan was on the floor playing with our son, who was about 3 at the time, maybe 4. And the light from the window was coming in at a sharp angle, and it was shining in their hair. And it caught my attention, and I looked at them, and this feeling, this beautiful, emotional feeling just rushed in. It just filled me, and I teared up. And it was so foreign to me, I didn't know what the hell was happening. I actually wondered if I was having like a nervous breakdown. But the feeling was amazing. It was the most beautiful feeling, right?
Mm.
Everything in my life changed after that. And what I came to see is what happened in that moment when I was looking at them is I saw them. I saw them without all my thinking from the past about all of our upsets and arguments. I saw them in that moment. And part of me really knew that I was looking at a truer reality. And that experience is still teaching me, because in that moment of seeing that truer reality, it gave me a much deeper understanding of my illusionary reality, you know, that we've been living in for years, right? So all of us have that opportunity, particularly with Syd's materials, because he's speaking from that state. That's the beauty of what he brought to the world. It's not just that he brought us the 3 principles, is that he spoke from that state of mind. And we were very fortunate to know him personally and learn from him personally, but that's still available to everybody, right, in those materials. When we listen and our mind gets quiet and that beautiful feeling comes, then you become your own teacher. And that's really the goal.
Yes, thank you so, so much. I was just in a world of my own there, listening like, oh. No, I love that. I love that you talked about the information is in the feeling, and then your experience of seeing Jan and your son as, you know, in the trueness of who they actually were in that moment, and the fact that keeps teaching you. I think that's just wonderful, both of you. So thank you so much for being on my podcast. We're going to skedaddle over and go and talk to my little group. But is there, where can people find you? Do you have, I mean, I'd love to come to Salt Spring Island, but
We have our website,
Yeah.
vantageconsult.com, and there's lots of YouTube videos from there, and on YouTube, if you just Google Chip and Jan Chipman, there's a few videos of us on there too.
And if anybody has a direct question, either one of us can be reached at chip@vantageconsult.com or jan@vantageconsult.com. We'd be happy to get back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. Thank you guys for listening, and and we'll see you next week. Bye. Thank you for listening to Courage, Dear Heart. I really appreciate it. It would be amazing if you could leave me a review and press subscribe so that others who are looking to find freedom from anxiety and habits can find their way here. You can also go to my website, iamcharliewall.com, and subscribe, sign up for my emails, and you'll also find my Facebook group, Finding Freedom from Habits and Anxiety, on Facebook. So yeah, please do connect with me, and I'll see you next week.